Good evening. This is the September 10th meeting of the Bud Metheny chapter. We are honored to have author David Ostrowsky with us. David currently resides in Greater Boston. He's a sports writer for the Atlanta Jewish Times. He currently serves as corporate communications director for the FIA Group. And he's written three books, one in 2014, Game Over or Game On, How Pro Athletes Leave Sports and Enjoy the Game of Life. And in 2020, he wrote a book on sports in 1993, a signature season in football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. And the book we're going to discuss tonight, Roberto Alomar, The Complicated Life and Legacy of a Baseball Hall of Famer. So David, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And we're looking forward to talking about an athlete that we probably all watched come into the league and retire and go into the Hall of Fame. So it's always fun to talk about a contemporary athlete versus someone in the era that was before some of our times, not everyone.
Well, Drew, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. I know, speaking to you guys in Virginia, there might be some interest in the Orioles, so perhaps I can kind of lean a little bit towards there. But yeah, this is my book, the Roberto Alomar, Complicated Life and Legacy of a Baseball Hall of Famer. It came out this past winter, and it's funny. I grew up in the '90s. I was born in '84, so I became a fan really in the mid '90s, and at the time, there were only a few players of that skill set of the five tools, and Bonds and Griffey, obviously. But then I think Roberto Alomar is really in that conversation, and he was obviously kind of a guy who, when the Jays were, the best team in baseball in '92 and '93, he was in the middle of everything, both offensively and defensively, and I think he was a ball player who made it look so easy. I think that's probably just my memories of him. It kind of, I think back to just watching him in awe of just how he made such a difficult game look so easy. And, I was always really interested in his life story. And there never had been a biography of him. He had written after, when he was like 24 years old, when they won the first World Series, they written this brief memoir. But, over the past 32 years, there's been quite a bit more to his story since then, good and bad. So I really thought it was time that his life story got chronicled. And needless to say, writing this book, I had a very, very different perspective of him, on and off the field as I did when I was a little kid watching him play. Complicated is the operative word here. A lot of things I found were very heartwarming, other things far less so. I would like to mention that I started writing this book in May 2020, so a year before the recent allegations came out that prompted his, banishment from baseball. So that it wasn't like that was the reason I decided to write this. It just so happened that I was in the middle of writing this book when that development broke. Fortunately, I'd already done like 90% of the interviews for this book, because once that happened, it was very, very hard to get people to talk on the record about him. But in fairness, I did know that I was digging into the life story of someone who had a pretty complicated background. So to say I was, totally shocked that this new development came out, I don't think I was. But nevertheless, it was definitely, you know, um, it was a challenge in several different ways, is all I can say. But yeah, I hope the book, I provide a lot of different anecdotes, talked to dozens of his former teammates, opponents, coaches, managers, umpire, John Hirschbeck, friends, writers. So try to paint a pretty comprehensive picture. And I'd love to answer any questions that you guys may have about the book.
So did you consider, and I know in the book there's chapters of these, but did you ever consider increasing the scope of it to write about the whole Alomar family versus just
Yeah,
focusing on Roberto?
it's a very good question. I didn't, because I wanted a kind of a really laser focus just on one individual. In 2020, during the pandemic, I reached out to his manager, and he wasn't interested, Roberto, in participating at all. So at that point, his brother and father weren't interested either. So that it wouldn't have worked. But it's a good point. But I was so fascinated in Roberto's story, and quite frankly, his brother's story, Sandy. It's not quite as interesting, in my opinion.
Mhm.
You know,
And um, how what so during your research, it sounds like you weren't able to talk to the other Alomars as you
right?
wrote the biography, but were you able to piece together um, his relationship with his father Sandy and
Yeah,
his brother Sandy, and how were they how did they impact him, and how were they
yeah.
different?
Yeah, so it's funny because the first chapter, in answer to your first question, I mean, it's basically 80% of it is about his father. Growing up in Puerto Rico, in the 30s and well, his Sandy's father, growing up in the 30s and 40s, and then Sandy Senior, becoming a journeyman ball player in mid-century. I will say it's interesting, and obviously in the chapters 2 and 3, there's a lot about Sandy Jr. in there. And I think when Robbie was in single A, he was only 17 years old. In Charleston, summer 1985. And his father was a coach. He was a first base coach. And it seemed from talking to some of the guys on the team that his father was coaching to kind of not babysit him, but to kind of be there for him, right? Because he was so young, and a lot of these minor leaguers were already in their early to mid 20s, and he had some issues with some of the guys. They weren't always very, um, you know, approachable, let's say.
Right.
And his brother, they overlapped like for like a week in the when they were the Padres, and his brother got traded to Cleveland, and they were together a little bit in the Padres organization in the minors. They had very different personalities. I mean, Junior was very, very outgoing, guys would tell me. Um, just very friendly, would always offer advice. And Robbie was different. I mean, that was definitely from talking to over a dozen teammates and that who were on both of them, was very reserved, had this savant-like knowledge of baseball that he would share, but you had to go up to him, whereas Sandy was much more outgoing. So very different personalities in that regard.
Were you able to piece together in your research why their personalities were so different? Like what
Um,
drove that during their upbringing, or
yeah, no, well, I think in Toronto, when Robbie was there in the early 90s, I mean, he became a pretty big celebrity right away. He dated Pamela Anderson for a little bit. He lived in the Sky Dome in his own suite, and he had dozens, if not hundreds, of girls running up, all over him. And the newspapers were into his private life. And it became pretty apparent to him by the mid 90s when he was becoming the star player that he was living in this like fishbowl existence. And Sandy was just never that type of a celebrity as a player. I mean, a very popular player, especially in Cleveland. But Robbie was, you know, withdrawn, pretty early. He realized, he was going to have a crush of fans around him wherever he went. Although it's interesting, when he was in Baltimore, he was a bit overshadowed by Ripken and even Palmeiro and Musina to some degree. Um, and to take that a step further, in Cleveland too, he was not necessarily the biggest name because, of course, they had Manny Ramirez and Jim Tomei and Kenny Lofton.
right. What about was he sounds like, well, how did he develop relationships with his teammates, or did he develop relationships with his teammates? Um, and we'll save Cleveland to the end because I'm an Indians fan, but
Okay.
when he was in Toronto and
Yeah.
Baltimore, did he develop relationships with his teammates, or was he standoffish and didn't really do that?
So the one I wanted to talk about the most was Omar Vizquel, the relationship there, because that was by far the most fascinating one. But I'll get to it in a second. I think in Toronto, guys really only had good things to say about him. I mean, how could you not? Like he was such a key part of those World Series winning teams. I think in Baltimore, one guy um, I talked to, he pitched for a couple of years, Rick Krivda. He remembered him kind of feeling a little insecure that he wasn't the number one guy, that clearly, he was overshadowed by Ripken. That was right after the streak. He came over in 96 and his career, of course, was kind of winding down then, but he was still a very, very popular player. They had Brady Anderson, I mentioned Musino. Um, I mean, he was not a big name in the clubhouse, but the one, yeah, the big one of the three or four most intriguing plot lines I found writing this book was that he did not get along all that great with Omar Vizquel. They weren't necessarily enemies, but they weren't, hanging out together. They had issues, so to speak. I think Omar was beloved by the fans in Cleveland. He had been there a lot longer. Robbie comes over in '99, and he's not that the fans didn't like Robbie, but he was not this wildly popular player that Omar was, and he had issues with him and as well as Travis Fryman. I go to an example where they got it. I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but during the 1999 ALDS in Boston, there was a game where the Red Sox were absolutely destroying Cleveland in Game 4, and Robbie gets taken out in the eighth inning. And he leaves the dugout. He goes into the clubhouse, to say, screw this. Like, I'm done watching this. And he and Fryman get into a really nasty fight in the tunnel. And you know. So that was interesting, and again, I think that whole thing with Vizquel was very fascinating. That they all really didn't get along all that well.
And did they not get along because of the popularity of Omar versus Robbie, or was there other issues that drove
Well,
that rift?
I mean, I think you know he thought Omar, it came so easy to him. Like he thought maybe he didn't, work all that hard at it. I think a lot of it was just this. Omar was such a fixture in Cleveland by the time that Robbie came there in '99 that you know he was just the new guy in town and he was never going to get as beloved as much. I think that they just had different personalities. Omar was much more outgoing, and
Mhm.
I don't think by any means they were enemies or anything like that. But they weren't palling around together. They were not. Um, it's not like Giancarlo Stanton and Aaron Judge now. They're not. They weren't like good friends or anything like that. But I go into how there's a couple examples of how they had fights. But I don't think at the end of the day that that's too different from relationships on many stars have with each other.
Right.
Can I just say, because am I mute? No, I'm not, can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't read your book yet, but I am curious about what you project or what you wrote about Alomar and his current situation in terms of banishment from baseball and still being in the
Yeah.
Hall of Fame and all of that. And what do you think is going on in his life at this time?
That's a very good question. I don't, for a couple of reasons, I didn't dig super deep into it. I did include, the narrative that was published in the Toronto Star by one of his accusers. And I certainly, kind of include reports about what was published afterwards. It's interesting because I can tell you this, that maybe starting last year, he's gotten back into doing things with like autograph signings at different memorabilia conventions. He's on Cameo now. He was off it for a while. Um, so he has become a little bit more in the public eye, but he doesn't go to any major league events. He doesn't go to any Hall of Fame induction weekends. He didn't really go too much anyway, but he is active in Puerto Rico though, in some of the youth baseball leagues there. I would say if you look at his presence, aside from like memorabilia shows in the States, from a baseball perspective, that's probably the biggest influence he has in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico.
Um,
Is that
but I
where he's
will say
living
it's
right
very.
now?
I'm sorry.
Is that where he's living right now in Puerto Rico?
In Toronto, he's living, but he's
Or
going.
him
He's
living
in
in
Puerto
Toronto?
Rico pretty
Okay.
frequently. Yeah, he lives in Toronto. Yeah, but it's amazing to me how, aside from people in Toronto, people have such, for the most part, they think very little of him. I mean, he is just, it's just really fascinating for between the incident with Hirschbeck, these allegations, there were some 15 years ago, spreading HIV. People have not forgotten these things.
I got a question for you. I was looking
Yeah,
through baseball reference in preparation, so to speak. And one of the things that really shocked me is that he became a free agent from the Blue Jays in '95, at the end of '95.
right.
He joined the Orioles and took a 20% pay cut. That dumbfounds me. I mean, he was a multi-time All-Star and all that sort of stuff. Were there no other bidders, or how
The
did that
Yankees
come
were
about?
interested in him.
Excuse me?
Yeah, so he signed, I believe at the time the Yankees were pretty interested in him. And then they ultimately got Chuck Knobloch in '97. Um, but they were at the time interested. Well, the Orioles signed him, what was it, 3 years and 18 million, I want to say. It was
First year got 4.3, second year 6.3, third year 6.3, and when he was with Toronto, he was getting 5.5.
right.
So he took a 20% cut. He made it up a little bit in the last 2 years, but it's still not
Yeah,
a big payday.
no, no, it's not. I think the average value is 6 a year in Toronto. I mean, it's not all that much more than he was making. I mean, I think you look at someone like Francisco Lindor now, who like idolized him, who's making over 300 million, and there's no question, had Alomar come 20 years later, he'd be
Oh, yeah.
well over $250 million. Um, yeah, I mean, the Orioles, if I recall correctly, that year spent a lot of money on free agents. That was like the first year where they really went all in and they won the wild card, right? Um,
Right.
he only made like 8 million a year in Cleveland too. Like he had like a 4-year deal. So he never really made I think he totaled like 76 million in his career earnings, which, no one's feeling sorry for him, but that's not exactly you know, carrot
I got,
gold type money, right?
I got another follow-up question.
Yeah.
When we were at SABR, there was a memorable quote, which I'll try to grab for you here. It said, the character clause in the Hall of Fame. In the 20th century, baseball Hall of Famers were voted in without concern to cheating, spitball, or amphetamines, or racism, or drugs, or all that other stuff, let alone women. But in the 21st century, the Hall of Fame has not let a steroid person in. He got in 2014, I guess, on the second
11,
ballot. Excuse me?
2011. Yeah. 2011,
Yeah,
he got it.
yeah, second ballot. So he was clearly subject to the new morality, so to speak, and the steroids.
Yep.
But it got in second time with like 90% of the vote.
Right.
Was there any serious discussion of saying, no, you're going to be punished?
No. Because he
Okay.
got in, right? He was 6 or 7 votes short of getting in the first time. He was like around 73.5% in 2010. So it was pretty clear there were like 60 or 70 writers, who were just making him wait one more year because of this one incident, because he was obviously a first ballot Hall of Famer. And then I don't think there had ever been that big a jump between getting denied and then getting in consecutive years. It was like a 17% jump. Um, so I don't recall ever that, like, oh my God, could he go 15 years on the ballot and get rejected every year? I don't think that was ever an issue. It wasn't like a Jim Rice type thing where, he was like similar, but they have different players and stuff. Good
Were the
question.
allegations against Alomar ever confirmed? I mean, I remember it happening. He was banished, but I don't ever remember the end of it, right? I mean, did anything ever happen or did it get swept under the rug or?
So there was no civil lawsuit, if that's what you're asking. They didn't press any charges. They didn't,
Right.
so there was no settlement or anything like that. The first person who came out claimed that when she was volunteering at this Blue Jays camp in 2014, she was approached by him, and then two other women, one of whom, Melissa Verge, wrote this, account that I published provided pretty vivid detail about it. A very similar experience where she was approached by him in the Sky Dome, and they just wanted to raise awareness. And, I mean, I could just tell you that the commissioner, Rob Manfred and his staff, they did an investigation that lasted several months, speaking to dozens of people, and at which point there was inconclusive evidence that, these allegations were serious enough, incredible enough to warrant banishment, especially in the current environment. It's interesting
Right.
that what would have happened 30 years ago, maybe,
Right. Well, the other thing that's interesting is Omar Vizquel had a similar
Yeah, oh.
issue, right?
Horrible
Now, it
things, yeah.
was a little more
Allegedly, yeah.
current, right? It was a little more current because he was a coach and all that, but there was
Yep.
never anything proven about that either, right? And he was kind of
There's
blackballed.
multiple allegations that he abused this special needs clubhouse attendant, and he abused his
Right.
girlfriend or wife or something. I haven't really kept up with those other than, and if it's interesting though, the one thing I'll say about Vizquel is, if you notice, since those allegations have come out, he's disappeared from the ballot. Essentially, his numbers have
Right.
really dipped significantly.
Right.
What was your feeling about writing this book when all this happened? Must have
Yeah,
had-
I mean, like I said, I wasn't like totally shocked based on some of the things, people had kind of shared with me through the research. I thought truthfully it was going to be something that would really, like a Pete Rose type thing, where it was really going to be, a real compelling storyline and everyone was going to want to know a lot about this. But it's interesting because even though I make it very clear this is an unauthorized biography, it's like very objective. I'm not like writing this with him. People are still just very turned off by the fact that he's chronicled. There's some
I'm
people
sorry, I
are, I
didn't
should
hear
say.
that. The people are turned off
So-
by what?
Well, some people are just kind of very turned off that, he's the subject of a book. Even though, like I said, he had 0.0 participation and even told some of his close friends and relatives not to speak with me.
Hmm.
He found it's interesting that people are just so, turned off by this guy that they, don't even want. Some people are, again.
Right. Did you send him
Turned
a
off by
copy of the
him or
book?
turned off by the subject?
I'm sorry.
You think they're turned off by him or turned off by a discussion of this sensitive subject?
I think by him. I think honestly, most people, just based on like social media, it's like they can't get over the incident with Hirschbeck and
Mhm.
then the fallout from it. Even though it's the ironic thing is John, he's a nice guy and he spoke to me for this book, as did his daughter, and they raved about him. And because they become for the year starting in '99 actually, and Alomar and his brother have been big supporters of his foundation. So it's really ironic actually that so many people just still associate that with him, more so than getting banished from baseball for these horrible allegations. They still, they don't even know that they became friends, or there's kind of a backstory to what prompted that, and there's some the aftermath. A lot of people don't understand exactly what went down. I find that interesting. I mean, I don't know if you know, but by all accounts, he was called a derogatory homosexual name by Hirschbeck at that time.
Mhm.
And there had been rumors that he was gay. So it really kind of got under his skin at that moment. And a lot of people don't understand, kind of like the worst thing is, afterwards he brought up his dead son, in the clubhouse. And that's what really kind of sparked the, real animosity between them the following day.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen interviews with Hirschbeck, and he talks about how they finally mended their
Yeah.
fences,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
like you said, Alomar is a pretty big he helps Hirschbeck every year, I think, for a fundraiser and stuff for the
Yep.
first foundation. Yeah.
I think of all the storylines for the book, that would be by far the most compelling one. Just that friendship and how they were able to move past it. And because it's known, it's relatively unknown. So I thought that bringing that to light, I thought was really one of the most valuable things of one of the most just enlightening things of the book, I guess.
Was there anything you found during your research that surprised you that you didn't expect to learn
Um,
or?
yeah, I think that the scouting was interesting. I think when he was living in the Sky Dome in '95, at the end, someone threatened to kill him. A woman came in with a pistol. He had a stalker, this deranged stalker, and she was intent on killing him. And he was traumatized by gun violence as a young boy because his uncle was murdered, Tony Alomar in Puerto Rico. And I go into that. I talked to Louis Tion. He was good friends with his uncle. His uncle played in the minors, and that was a scarring episode of his upbringing. Um, I don't want to give too much away again, but that to me was a really fascinating anecdote to share.
Hmm.
And I think it also accounts for his, why he was so reclusive at times.
Is there any indication of steroid use during his career?
No, no, none. And I point that out in the book. He retired in March 2005 when he was in Tampa. And like it was the same week, it was in like 48 hours of McGuire and Sosa and Palmero, the Capitol Hill hearings. And it's kind of the ironic thing is like he's retiring at a time, he was like 37 at the time, the natural progression of an athlete's career. And here, McGuire and Sosa were, extending their careers or had been. But no, none at all.
Yeah, especially with he was with the Brady Anderson years where
Yeah,
Brady
yeah,
turned into he went from
yeah,
Miles Straw to Babe Ruth in 1 year, right? The guy was
yeah. 49 home runs or something.
yeah. So it's I'm sure steroids were going around that clubhouse, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So like probably 100% of the teams.
Well, his career started tailing off as I look at Baseball Reference
Yeah,
somewhere around when he was 34, which
right.
would be normal for most
Yep,
baseball players up until the steroid era where they got
yeah,
a
right.
renaissance. Yeah.
They,
And he
they
fell
got
off
a
the cliff.
second win.
I mean, when he went over to the Mets in '02, I mean, he was for a season an average player, then not even that the next year, and then he was just bouncing around for a few teams in '04.
So in terms of second baseman, have you thought about where you would put him in the pantheon of second basemen? Right,
So it's
there's
really
Joe
hard because
Morgan, Rogers
yeah,
Hornsby. There's a lot of
yeah, Charlie Gehringer, right?
right.
I don't know. It's a good question, but it's so hard because they played in different eras, and B, the guys you mentioned, I wasn't really around to see. So I personally can't, I go into that a little bit. I kind of compare some of the numbers, not the advanced stats, but just like the Gold Gloves and you know, the the hitting metrics with like, Sandberg and Lou Whitaker and, Hornsby and Eddie Collins and Gehringer and Morgan, obviously. I don't know. I thought he was pretty good. I mean, today the comparison, I guess, would be Jose Altuve. Um, Altuve won't have nearly the number of Gold Gloves, but he did win an MVP and a batting title, which Alomar didn't do. But they've also won 2 World Series, and like Alomar, he's got his own sin going on there with the cheating. So I think that's a pretty apt comparison for today.
Right.
You said that you didn't weren't privy to the family input into this book, but do you have any
Right.
any concept, any feeling at this stage of the game where they stand after all of this, or what their relationship with Robbie is?
Well, I get the sense that he and his brother are still pretty close. I mean, his father's 80, I want to say, and he's living in Puerto Rico. I mean, just from following them on social media, and the mom, I mean, I get the sense that they're close. I mean, Robbie remarried a woman, and he has a kid with her. Um, you know, the parents live in Puerto Rico. Well, Sandy is a base coach in Cleveland,
Right.
and then Robbie, like I said, lives in Toronto. But in
What's
terms of
next for
baseball
you?
families, yeah,
What's next for you?
I'm working on a biography of Jim Rice that's going to be coming out in a few years.
Of
The
who? I'm
University,
sorry.
Jim Rice,
Ah,
yep. The University of Nebraska Press is going to be publishing it in 27.
So your other books, well, you had 6 years and then 4 years. So
Yeah.
how long have you been working on Jim Rice's book?
Yeah, I started it, let's see, a couple of years ago, just like a little bit, and then like
Yeah.
last summer I got into it again. And it's kind of weird because you're like, you send the manuscript in and then you wait like a year for it to get published. But then at the same time, you have to go back and forth with your publisher about like the index and corrections and photos and permissions and yada yada. So I don't know, I've been working on and off for the past couple of years on it. If that answers your question.
And what kind of access have you had to, is Jim a part of this
No, same
or
thing.
no?
It's as is often the case with these guys, it's unauthorized. It's usually if someone's passed already, then their family is, especially if they haven't had their story chronicled, they're much more open to providing access. But when someone's still alive, if they're not interested, then their circle's usually not as interested. And if there's no money involved for them, quite frankly, then
Right,
they're much less inclined
right.
to help. And if there's nothing in it for them, then
You write about non-baseball figures?
I
People?
beg your pardon.
Do you write about people who didn't play baseball?
Not for books, no. No, I'm really, biographies are interesting because you really get into the person's life, obviously, and it's not just the summary of their baseballreference.com page. You can really dig into. I mean, most of the book isn't about baseball per se. It's about the off the field things and the relationships and different cultural dynamics and the history behind things, which to me is much more fascinating. I'm not really a stats guy, to be honest with you.
Right. So I mean, Jim Rice playing in Boston,
Yeah,
I mean, there's a whole acceptance part of Jim
yeah,
Rice, right? Because Boston was never very accepting of African American baseball players,
right,
right? And
right.
so is that
Big
a
storyline. Yep,
a big part of your storyline, or is that just
huge.
one of many?
Huge. I mean, that saving the boy, in 1982, Jonathan Keene with foul ball, is kind of the opening scene. The relationship with the press, uh, his son Chauncey had some issues, but the race relations is by far the biggest storyline of the book.
Mhm.
Just because, again, Hall of Famer by definition is a great, great player, right? So for me to just summarize, some of his feats, kind of access that fairly easily.
Right. Where was he born? I forget where he was born. Was he born in the South? Where was?
Yeah, Anderson, South Carolina.
Okay.
It's the western part of the state.
Yeah.
the hammer of God. You remember that quote from Giamatti? The Jim Rice, the hammer of God sent to scourge the Yankees.
Is that what he referred to him as? Yeah.
That's one of his fabulous essay that he read at a program called Selected Shorts, and he talks about um, it's the green fields of the mind is the name of the essay, and
Green Fields of the Mind.
green fields of the mind, and Giamatti, the ex
Okay.
commissioner of
Yeah.
baseball, Paul's father.
Paul's father. Yeah.
And he writes about this game at Fenway Park at the end of the season when it's the Red Sox are playing. Well, they're not playing the Yankees, but they're in it a little bit, and they've got a chance to win a game. And he calls them the hammer of God, here to scourge the Yankees. a
gonna
great
look that
essay.
essay up. I'm gonna
That's a
check it
real-
out.
Yeah,
Thank you.
check it out.
Get a new
I
source.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
sure.
Carl, you'll get a reference in the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you very
All
much for
right.
having me, gentlemen. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks
Yeah,
for
thank you
thanks
very
for
much.
joining us. And
My pleasure.
I've got a list of baseball books that I've got to purchase and read, and this one is on
Oh,
it
thank
because
you.
of his tie with Cleveland, and I always like to read about those things. So
Thank you. I
I
appreciate your interest.
appreciate it.
If anyone has any questions, follow-up questions, or please feel free to email me, always happy to hear from folks.
Keep on
Thanks
writing.
for taking the time.
All right.
Yeah, keep on writing.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with your Jim Rice
Yeah.
book.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it,
Good
gentlemen.
luck with your
Take care
kids
now.
too.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
So Carl, you had questions about Saber 52.
Well, I mean, I just like to hear from, were all you guys
So
there? I don't,
I was
Paul and I were there,
okay.
so you could get our perspective, but I don't know how
Well,
accurate a perspective that would be.
you know, it's one of those things where, you know, do I go to this thing that, you know, it costs a fair amount of money and spending time a long ways from home and
Right.
you know, what's the best part of all this? I mean, it's baseball, so it's got to be good, but you know, what are your takes on the whole the whole weekend? Or is it a weekend or right? Is it a weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's usually Thursday through Sunday. Sunday's kind of a wrap-up day where there's not a lot of presentations.
Uh-huh.
But Paul, what are your thoughts? You've been to two now. I've been to
Um,
eight or nine. I can't
yeah,
remember.
I go to the last two. First of all, it's fun to be I mean, deep inside, everybody's got a nerd part of it, whatever your nerdish part is. I have friends who are nerds for grammar, like grammar, really? And they secretly talk about grammar. Well,
Okay.
for me, it's baseball, okay? And when I should be doing other things, I'm either watching a meaningless game or reading stats or something like that. And suddenly you're in a collection with several hundred similar nerds who have the same nerdish little passions. And it's really easy to socialize with every one of these guys. I say guys because vast majority they're all white men. That's what they
Right.
are. But um, and you could just sit down with any one of them and start talking about their team, their town, their heritage. I had the best time, I think, with the guys from Montreal who Expos became the Nationals, and I just learned all about Montreal's time. But the presentations themselves are generally top notch, and Minnesota went out of the way to make this a very special occasion by bringing in the Hall of Famers and the old timers and broadcasters and management GM, which is not always the case, uh, because some towns don't treat Sabre very much and other ones adopt it. How about you?
So,
Yeah,
what about you, Drew, in terms of you've gone to so many of them, you've been to different locations. Do they vary a lot location to location?
I'd say the format is typically the same. You know, what the different locations try to do is pretty similar. What I found, what I thought Minnesota did very well was, you know, Paul alluded to it, was the acceptance or the enthusiasm of both the Twins management team and the St. Paul Saints management team. One of the presentations that I found well, there were two that I found absolutely fascinating. One was they brought in um, the general manager of the Twins, the head of his analytics department, and a couple analysts. And they talked about the use of analytics in baseball And not, they didn't get into what they look for because they're not going to give away their secret sauce, but just how it's changed over time, how they're organized. And what I found, and I got the same feeling when I went to the Baltimore convention and listened to their GM. They are so smart. They're so well spoken. They brought in they hired a physicist 4 years ago to come in and help with their pitching analytics. And they found this gentleman because he wrote on, I forget what baseball blog he was writing on. It could have been Seamhead or may have been Baseball Reference, but just he would write about how he would write about the physics of baseball of the baseball and how it impacted, how they could change the shape of their pitches and those kinds of things.
Launch
But
angles
they're
too.
just, yeah, launch angles and those kinds of things. But the people are so smart, and they're able to communicate so that a knucklehead like I can listen to it and understand it and really enjoy it. And so I found that really fascinating. And then they also had a panel, future of baseball broadcasting. And they had the owner of a local television station. They had, I'm looking it up here. They had a writer from The Athletic. I don't know if anybody here subscribes to The Athletic, Evan Drellich, who writes about baseball and or broadcasting in general and sports. And then they had announcers, right? And just the whole, how the game has changed and how streaming is really impacting the revenues of baseball, and how they're trying to figure it out. They really still don't know how they're going to make money on the streaming side in baseball. The one statistic, and Paul, you can correct me on this. The gentleman that owned the local baseball station or television station talked about streaming. And he said things like, when a cable operation adds a customer, it's really pennies or dollars to add that customer, to get them cable and the programming that they want. But he said for streaming, because of the cost of servers and those kinds of things, he said the cost to add the next person, I want to say, Paul, he said $100 was the cost to the station of adding a streamer. So if you think about that, that really just the economics around streaming and growing your streaming base and making baseball or any sports thing profitable is really interesting, because what are you gonna, you have to charge. It was $100 a month, I want to say, Paul. I can't remember if
I
it was
didn't write down
$100
the
a
number. I
month.
remember that discussion. He closed it by saying only Netflix is figure out how to make money off of streaming, and nobody
How to
else
make
is.
right,
Amazon is doing it to lose. They're accepting the fact, Amazon, that they want to lose, or they're willing to lose money because they're trying to get in the market for the next broadcasting bid.
right,
And they
right,
fully expect the next broadcasting bid to be distributed kind of like football, where there's a Thursday night and a Friday night and so forth game, which they're all fighting for the rights for playoffs
right.
too. And they were, for those that don't know, and I didn't know much about it, the Diamond Sports went into bankruptcy. They're owned by a casino organization, and they wound up shutting down at least 4 teams broadcasting, including the Twins.
Well, there were 7 part of the Diamond Sport Group. It's Diamond Sports / Bally's.
I was
Bally's,
gonna
but I
say
mean,
Bally's is one of them because
Yeah,
I've heard about that.
Yeah, but
They
four
carry the
lost the
Braves.
broadcasting. Yeah. So
Yep.
they lost the broadcasting and the fans they had radio. That was it.
right.
And they can't get out of it because under Chapter 11 rights, you can't get out of your contract, even if you're not getting anything for it, because they have a claim for that. And I'm not a lawyer, but I thought that was all very fascinating, how mucked
Yeah.
up the current system is.
Right.
So
You guys both
And-
mentioned how Minnesota was pretty cool and welcoming and all in terms of the management and all that. I have an old friend who lived for many years in Minneapolis area. Is there anything in particular that I know that there's still stuff put out on YouTube through SABR, right? And is there any particular Minnesota focused presentation that would be interesting maybe for him to watch?
There is a presentation on Negro League baseball, and like the impact of the or Minnesota's impact on the Negro Leagues.
Mhm.
There was, remember the author who came to speak with us about Mike Donlin, Steve
Yeah.
Steinberg.
Yeah.
He gave another presentation which was really interesting. It was a different twist on Mike Donlin, but I thought that was worth listening to. And the other thing that's really interesting, and Paul, I don't know if you watched the trivia contest. The knowledge that people can pull out of their heads is just incredible to me. Just incredible. So they did the trivia contest this year. Usually in years past, you would go in Friday night and you would take a piece of paper and you would do your trivia thing. And then you'd score it with other people, and they had teams and they had individuals. So this year they did that as well, but they didn't score it there. They just handed it into the people running the contest. And then the finalists they had on stage, and they set it up like a Family Feud kind of thing. Then the individuals, they set it up more like a password, not password, is that right? Jeopardy, a Jeopardy game, the Jeopardy game. And they had different categories and all that. And it was just, I mean, it's just amazing what people can remember. And maybe I'm just amazed because I have such a poor memory for that kind of, for long-term stuff, but it's just amazing. Just amazing. I was actually, the other fun part of going to the conferences is just the interactions you have with other people after the conference is over in the hotel lounge or other bars or breweries around Minnesota. But one night I was sitting and Paul, were you with us? We were talking to Scott Bush, the CEO. Were you there?
I don't think I was.
Did that?
I don't remember talking to
So
him.
Saturday night, I was sitting there with one of my friends from Philadelphia, and Scott Bush was there with the central office groups, and so he came up, and I was just talking with him, and I was remarking to him how I just am blown away by the knowledge these people have and how they can recall it. And he said, he asked me if I ever met a certain person. I said, no, I can't remember meeting him. And he said, well, he can tell you the last out of every World Series in history, chronologically, or, so that's the kind of personalities and that are in the organization. And I looked at him and I said, well, Scott, I said, that's interesting. I said, but that's marginal utility in life, right? I said, the only value to me that is if you're in a bar and you're trying to win beers from somebody, right? And you could do that to, but it wasn't the score, which he could tell you also. It was the last out of every World Series. It's like, who can remember that stuff? I can't remember, the last meal I had. This guy
That's a
can remember.
savant. That's what that
Yeah,
Yeah, picture perfect memory. I can't remember all that.
yeah. Just
Several
crazy.
panel,
Of the experts that talked,
Yeah.
the experts that gave the presentations, the GMs, the analytics staff, and so on, yeah, you know that all the people there who are attending the conference as SABR members have their primary interest is baseball, obviously. But some of these guys in front offices never played baseball, never
Right.
had contact with baseball. They happen to be driven into this direction because they had business experience and computer experience and management experience, that baseball was an industry that needed their expertise. How much of these front office people actually have a true love of baseball? Do you get a feeling for that?
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, I would say 100% of the
Do
people
they?
had a true love
Okay.
for baseball. But you're right, Ray. I mean, many of them, their baseball careers ended in Little League, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they just, people don't have the skills. I just go back to the fact that, one of the questions always comes up is, well, how do I get in? How do I get into baseball, right? That we met some of the people that won scholarships, the college kids or high school kids that won scholarships. Paul and I were talking to them one evening at the welcome reception, and everybody wants to know, how do I get into baseball? And I thought one of the, just listening to how people were discovered by these organizations, a lot of it is they love baseball. They're doing something else. The one guy was a physics professor, or he worked for NASA, one of the two, and he was just writing articles for baseball blogs. And all these guys read all that stuff, and so a couple of them read it and said, "Hey, this guy has some creative ideas," and they went after him and brought him in, right? Versus him hunting them down. So I think the message to the audience, to the younger people in the audience, was, if you want to be involved in baseball or any other sport, the way you get noticed is by doing work about that sport when you're not in it, and showing that you have aptitude and you have good analytics skills and those kinds of things. So I just thought it was really interesting how people were actually, quote unquote, discovered, right, and got in interviews into these front offices.
What about
Yeah,
what about individuals in the healthcare professions, physicians, physical therapists, stuff like people like that? Are they involved in this, in the conference?
No, there really wasn't much discussion about that side of the game, right? I mean, people ask questions. One, Burt Blyleven, Jim Cott, um, two other pitchers were part of LaTroy Hawkins was part of a pitchers panel. So a lot of conversation, questions from the audience was about um, injuries and, why are pitchers getting hurt, and people, how are they figuring it out? But there was no um, there was nobody there with that background that provided any insight that I can remember. Paul, do you
no,
remember anything?
no.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
So
within
anyway, I
the
guess
medical profession, sports medicine has become a specialty of its own, obviously. And so those physicians who become interested generally are people who had, in some time in their life, played or participated or been associated with sports of some nature, whether it be baseball, football, basketball, or whatever. So I'm surprised that they didn't have a session on injuries, because nowadays, I mean, you look at the newspaper every day and you see 3 or 4 guys going on the disabled list for Tommy John surgery. So I would think that there must be a thirst for knowledge about, what does that mean? What does a torn ulnar collateral ligament mean? Why does R.A. Dickey doesn't have a torn collateral ligament, and yet why was he still able to pitch Major League Baseball?
right. Well, when the analytics panel was there, there were questions to them about, because, you know, they have all the camera data and all the spin data and all those kinds of things. There were questions to that panel about how are, you know, and they wouldn't answer it, but basically it was like, are you looking at data to try to discover keys to preempt injury, right?
Yeah.
Like what, like looking back on people that tore their UCL or, you know, or going through Tommy John, have you gone backwards and looked at their data to see, is there anything that's common amongst all these people that you can see before it actually happens? But nobody's really there yet, they
Yeah.
said, right? All the biomechanics and stuff.
They made a
Ray, you
made a
bring up
point.
a very, go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Paul.
Well, they made one of the pictures from the Twins made a point. It says, "We know everything that you need to know about the elbow. You know, Tommy John, we could fix that, but very little in regards to shoulders, and rotator cuffs and all that other stuff. And that's kind of the big weakness in baseball sports medicine."
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like some wise people in healthcare say, you know, we shouldn't necessarily be studying only the pathology, but what makes people like Nolan Ryan different from the people that, you know, last a
right.
year or two, you know, and
Or
what
Bob
should we be
Gibson,
doing in
any of those
training to
guys.
prevent, what's the preventative measures we should be taking?
I don't know. Can't remember what the name of the blog was. I was listening to a blog or a podcast, and they were talking about the amount of innings and the amount of pitching that they do at such a young age, and how they're really just being taught to throw as fast as they can versus actual control. And this is burning out their arms earlier in life because they're just, you know, at 8 years old, they're just trying to throw it as fast as they can, and they're tearing up their arms that way.
Right before they mature, before all the tendons and
Yeah.
everything have had a chance to mature.
Where, you know, when we were kids, they were like, just throw a strike, you know, practice on control. And they're more focused on, you know, doing all the different types of pitches and throwing as fast as you can.
One of the players, and I can't remember who, made a point of saying kids playing year round are
Yeah,
no,
that's the other
that's
thing we
bad.
talk about, travel ball.
And that you need to develop yourself as an athlete or whatever passes for an athlete to be a baseball player,
Right,
by playing other sports. So you develop your legs and other muscles as well.
right. So I would recommend that if anybody has the time and the money to go, I find it well worth it. It's just so interesting to be able to spend 3 or 4 days with people that share the same passion. It really is a good time. It's fun.
That's good. It's good to hear from you guys and your
Yeah.
perspective and what you experienced. So that's very
And
helpful.
next year is in Dallas, so
June 25th through the 28th.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
start saving your nickels.
Well, you know, you mentioned broadcasting and trivia, so just so you know, I got to tell you that yesterday was an important, the 59th anniversary of Sandy Koufax's first game. So, and Vince Scully's announcement of the last inning. So, you know, if you have a chance, go on YouTube. It's just a day late, but you know, have a listen to Vince Scully at his best,
Yeah.
Right.
and
Right.
Sandy at his best.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thanks for attending. And our next meeting is in September, I believe. It's our
Nope, this is
fall meeting.
September.
This is
No,
September.
this is September. I'm sorry. What's our, let me look. I have it.
You are
I have it
retired,
right
aren't you?
here. I am retired. It's in our fall meeting is 11/9/24, November 9.
Okay,
Oh,
So,
great.
all right, guys.
Not
Have a
October?
good,
I'm sorry, there's no October?
no, right now there's nothing in October.
Oh, okay. So that would be October 14th, right? Oh, I got the wrong year here. 13th. What do I got here? Boy, I'm flipping my calendar too much. So did you say we're not having one in October?
Yeah, right now there's I am traveling, and so I didn't have any speakers, so if we want to have a meeting where we can, I was going to get our leadership guys together in a couple weeks and just kind of plan out what we want to do going forward. But
I'm trying to get my brother-in-law to do one of these. He's been a TV cameraman for 50 years, sports.
oh, yeah,
And he's done countless World Series and Super Bowls, and he's got 2 Emmys, but he's primarily known for being the the guy in the booth with at the Mets and the Yankees. And when they're out of town, he swaps
how
and
fun.
works. So he's got 1,000 stories, but he has a distinctive way of telling it. He starts cracking up at the punchline. So I got to work with Al on his presentation, but he's a good guy. I'll see if I can get him to come on.
All right. Good night, everybody. Good
Night,
to see
everybody.
everybody.
Take
And,
care.
and Ray, I sent you another email. I'm
Oh,
embarrassed to
about
say.
that you're not getting back until later.
Yeah.
I got it.
All right.
All right, I'll let
Let
them
me-
know. We'll get you started sooner or later.
All right. Take care.
All right,
Thanks.
thanks.
All right,
Bye.
good night.
Good night.
Have a good trip. Bye.